I want to play this little clip, but I want to stay on this part about China and India for a second because I want to get to something very very important that never ever gets addressed, and I want to address it on this show. So let me play this, and I want you to just listen to this little 40-second clip here. Here we are.
China would be even a bigger nightmare for the West because look at China's standing as a socialist country, as a country that offers so much aid to other countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America. It's an entirely different ballgame. And, if the United States tries to use Taiwan as a pawn against China, their defeat on that issue, I'm not talking militarily at this time, but politically, will be much more resounding than their impending defeat of the using Ukraine as a pawn against Russia.
They're saying that in so many words. He's saying if you think the U.S. is losing against Russia and Ukraine, if they try to pull this with China and Taiwan, it's a whole different ball game. But I want to ask you something about India because a lot of people they don't like to ask these questions, but I have to. Now, there's a border issue between China and India. Why is it that India is so suspicious of China when China is trying to have direct investment and infrastructure build up in India and help it modernize? And yet they are not that suspicious with their colonial masters, and they allow Britain to do X, Y, and Z, and they have a short memory. All they do is bring up, well, you colonized us, but they're willing to bend over backwards for the United States, the UK, and the Western colonial nations, and yet a person because India can't pick up its borders and go over to the West, but a nation that's right next to it that is trying to invest and trying to put in a win-win situation, India continues to provoke, to stoke, and even with these little bans on Chinese companies and Chinese investment and stuff. Why is that? Is there a mentality of the Chinese kicked our butts in 1962 that they just can't get over?
Yes. So India has a very westernized elite. I think I highly recommend people to look up what Malcolm X have said about India versus China. And but India from the very beginning, during the British India rule, uh, the Britain they only had, you know, Britain is a small country to rule all over India. They have their own colonial bureaucrats who sit on the top, but they really rely on this bureaucracy of the Indian elites to run their empires for them. So when India became independent in 1947, the top layer got removed, the British got removed, but all these Indian elite who were running the British bureaucracy in India just inherited this the whole colonial legacy, and but they're still very much oriented to the West. If you look at the top Indian leaders, you know, Nehru, for example, he was educated in the West.
Mm-hmm.
All of them speak English. They're very plugged in into what's happening in the West. This goes beyond India. This goes to a lot of the colonial elite all across the world. They have been sometimes they might be more in tune with, you know, Hollywood or Western pop culture than what's going on in their own country. And this is why they India and China had the border issues starting from very beginning, starting from 1950s, because they essentially inherited the colonial border of the British India, which the British tried to impose on then China. You know, British unilaterally draw those lines on a map and declare this is our territory, and you know, a lot China had confronted similar issues. For example, when in their border negotiation with Myanmar, because Myanmar was also part of the British India. They also inherited this colonial borders. But China and Myanmar were able to settle this dispute peacefully. China largely agreed to leave the colonial border as they are, um, um, and 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 then they finalized that border and left it at that. Whereas India, what happened? There was two sections of the border. They have the eastern section, which is bordering near the Myanmar boundary dispute. They have a western section, which is near Ladakh. And what happened is in the 1950s, the Chinese premier Zhou Enlai made a proposal like, let's do a land swap. We control this bits that you dispute. You control this bits we dispute. Let's just freeze the border as is and make it final international border. We'll give you the eastern sector. You give us a western sector, but the Indian leadership did not agree because they saw that China already made concession to Myanmar in their border, so they knew what China's bottom line was. They knew that China was about to. They expected China to give up. Chinese bottom line was they were expecting China to give in concessions in the eastern sector. So they're like, no, we like to have the western sector too. Like they refused to do the kind of give and take negotiation, and that in 1950. But the relationship really broke down in 1959 after the Tibetan revolt in Lhasa, and the Dalai Lama escaped to India. So China blamed India for sponsoring Dalai Lama's revolt in Tibet. And that really led to kind of the flaring up of the border tensions. And that eventually led to the 1962 border war. And I think you are correct that the 1962 war, which China defeated India, I think that cast a long psychological shadow among the Indian ruling elite because they feel like they need to do something about this. That's why, like, India always try to compare itself with China. It's interesting because in the Chinese media, China tend to compare itself with the United States, and by India try to compare itself with China because in the 1980s when I was born in China, at that time the GDP per capita between India and China about the same. And it's about the same throughout the 1980s. But as China started its opening and reform, by 1990s, the Chinese economy just took off. And now, when China and India economy about the same in the 1980s, right now, India is only about a third of it's much smaller economy than China is. And this made a lot of the Indian elite uncomfortable because this is really reflect a failure on their own failure of governance, right? They failed to develop India as quickly, as fast as China have done. And this is, but on the other hand, India elite is also not united. India is more like the West in the way how their society is structured. They have the oligarchs who control all the resources. You have so they like the Ambani's clan who sponsor Modi in the government. They have a monopoly in the Indian. They're trying to monopolize the Indian tech sector, but they're facing competition when the Chinese seed money is coming in to fund all these Indian tech startups. So what they did is using this leverage in this Indian-China border tension, they got Modi to ban Chinese investment into the Indian startups. Then the Ambani themselves, they came up with the Geo, which is actually formed in partnership with Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook. And so the oligarchical elite of India are in cahoots with the American tech bros and the American billionaires. They work together to monopolize the Indian market. So they have an incentive to keep the Chinese investment fund coming in to fund all those Indian tech startups. So there's that at play too. If you look at the class analysis, it start to make a lot more sense. The Indian oligarchical capital, they are more aligned with Western capital to keep out the competition and to keep the market for themselves. And in a way, they what Ambani clan they have developed is they just take Facebook, the technology from Facebook, they slap their brand on it, and then they have a monopoly over all of Indian population because the government helped them out to keep the rest of the population. So they keep on. It's like a rent-seeking enterprise. They're collecting rent on the Indian economy, basically. So there's a very powerful force to kind of prevent this cooperation from China and the foreign direct investment, because all these Indian oligarchs have long dominated the Indian economy. They like to keep the way things are. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, but I wanted to, and we can move on a little bit more, but I wanted to go back to this border issue just 1 second, because when that war popped off, the Chinese had given warning to Nehru a few times before it happened that they were stepping over China's red lines, and because at first they were friends or whatever, and when the war broke out, the Chinese broke through the Indians' lines like this. They could have taken New Delhi if they could have went on to New Delhi and taken it if they wanted to. Why did they unilaterally, after doing what they did, pull back? Because to me, they could have taken the disputed territories if they wanted to.
So this is something I highly recommend, a book called India's China War by Neville Maxwell, who is an Australian journalist based in India. He had access to the secret Henderson report from Indian government. So after the war, after the defeat, the Indian government commissioned its military to do a thorough background investigation to see how this whole thing came about. And this is the famous Henderson report, which remained classified till this day because the Indian government don't want the public to know. But Neville Maxwell, he had the access to this report through his network. So he based a lot of his findings to write the book, India's China War. And this really, this is so first of all, Nehru was the one he often gets a blame. And in the 1950s, there was a period when China and India were in the honeymoon phase. It's called the Hindi-Chini bye-bye period. Literally China, India brothers. And this is also kicked off in the we talk about spirit of Bandung, in the Bandung conference in 1955, when Nehru and Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai both attended in Bandung, Indonesia, because India and China were the leaders of the non-aligned movement. But then fast forward a few years later, at the time the Indian opposition, led by the Indian Nationalist Party, which later became the BJP, the ruling party today, they want India to align with the West. They didn't want India to align too closely with China. So they made the border issue a big domestic issue in India. They're accusing Nehru of selling out to the Chinese. So the Nehru himself, that he has to be tough. He's like, okay, I'm tough on national security. And this is why this led to the kind of the deadlock in the border negotiation, because Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai made a very sensible proposal. Let's just freeze the conflict. Let's just see what the area your control is become yours, and where area we control become ours, and make an international border, then there will be no more border dispute. But Nehru rebuffed that offer, and this has led to 1959, when the Indian opposition demand the Indian military to enforce their border, which previously only existed on paper. When British drew a line across the map. So this is and the British drew two lines: one line in the western section of Ladakh, and another line in the eastern sector called McMahon Line. In the western sector, because that's a sector that India never controlled, in the 1950s, China built a road connecting Xinjiang and Tibet through that territory. And the Indian newspaper got a wind of that. It's like, oh my God, China is building a road on the Indian territory. We have to do something about that. And so Nehru, pushed by his own opposition, decided to send troops to enforce the Indian claim. And they advanced on both fronts. And now, on the eastern sector, the McMahon Line, China said that was an illegal line drawn by British. They didn't recognize it, but Chinese troops never crossed that line. Then in 1960s, when the Indian army arrived at the McMahon Line, they look at the whole reason that the British drew the line is because they find out there was a piece of Tibet that extended south of Himalayas, and they thought, oh, that's unacceptable. Like the Tibetans, by extension, the Chinese government, they will have control of the high ground, and then they'll place us at a disadvantage. The border should run at the crest of the mountain of the Himalayas. So they wanted to push all the Tibetan administration from the south of Himalayas across to the north, and so that's why they drew the line. And in fact, the British themselves forgot about it because in 1914 the First World War broke out, so they kind of forgot about it. By 1930s, when the Japanese were advancing, they're like, okay, we need to look at the map again, and they pull out the map from the archive. Oh wait, we had a claim line that's run right on the top of the Himalayas. So then they send in the troops in 1940 to enforce their claim. And then in 1950, the Indian government followed their policy to throw out the Tibetan officials from the Lhasa government that was stationed in Taiwan, etc. So when the Chinese army came to Tibet in 1950s, they were approached by the representative from Dalai Lama's government, saying, we have a dispute with the Indian government. and this is how the dispute became known. But the Chinese largely respected the McMahon Line drawn by British because they never crossed it. And when the Indian military arrived, they look at the line on the map and they look at the mountain. They're like, oh, there was one section of the McMahon Line that were not drawn to the spirit of McMahon Line, because they said that the mountaintop is over there, but the line is drawn over here. So we need to follow the spirit of McMahon Line and push the border actually across north of the McMahon Line to the top of the mountain over there. And so at that point, when they even crossed the illegal border drawn by the British. At that point, that's when the Chinese army responded in 1962. The Mao said, they've been fucking with us for 3 years. This is unacceptable. And then he ordered the Chinese army to counterattack. They pushed the Indian army across the McMahon Line, and they briefly took over the disputed territory in the eastern sector. But then China made an announcement to withdraw. I mean, I think it's based on a couple reasons. One is they didn't want to antagonize. They want to still leave room for negotiation with India on the border issue. They didn't want to permanently antagonize the relationship by simply occupy the disputed area. And two, I think, this is my guess, is because the oncoming winters, because the mountain passes over the Himalayas will freeze for 6 months. Then the Chinese army south of the Himalayas will be trapped without supplies for 6 months. And so for tactical reason also, they withdrew. But also they show goodwill. They say we didn't come here to take away the disputed land by force. They're still hoping to leave room for negotiation. This is another thing I have to point out is when the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949, inherited border dispute across all of its borders because of the past issues of the colonial encroachment, from Tsarist Russia in the north, the British and the French in the south. But China managed to resolve all its land border dispute with every single country, with the exception of India and Bhutan. And Bhutan is because India handles Bhutan's foreign policy. So really, India is the one that the only one that's holding out because it does not want to negotiate the border, and this is why the border issue festered till today. And add to that, I think it's because of they can witness that China somehow pull ahead of India in development in the last 40 years. This created some kind of unsettled feeling on the part of the Indian elite, and this is why there's also there's like the India's westernized elite that they're more comfortable to look to the West, even though what right now India has been serving for the past 30 years is to basically to provide human capital for the Western economic development. If you look at what India's the most promising sector in India is their vaunted service economy. The call centers and software, etc. They are to provide the support for the service economy of the West. The difference is in China. The Chinese manufacturing is actually serving the needs of not only export to the outside world, but to also the Chinese people. Because as we talked about before, like in the 1980s, all the manufactured goods in China had to be imported. But what China did is import substitution. Now China can make refrigerators and TVs, so the Chinese people don't have to import that anymore. But the same thing is not happening in India. They are still kind of function as kind of almost like their service economy is wholly oriented towards servicing the Western economy. I think this is kind of the major difference, and this is why I explain the Western orientation of the Indian elite, because culturally they're more in tune with the West, and because their economy, their financial elite is also more in cahoots with the West.
Now,
hopefully that explains something.
Man, you're getting everything on the head. I'm gonna ask you this question myself, and then from that point on, after you answer my question, we'll go to the chat. If you guys have any questions, please put them up. We won't hold them much longer. But if you have any comments,